personality politics of the day is what drove us in a certain direction on both sides of the divide of tika and ture. That's what drove us on both sides. And what was on this side with the ones following the LAW was they felt that it was to protect our ariki from being pulled down into the paru of politics within the tribe. Yes, in theory, no in reality. And this is where having a full understanding of our tika pono and aroha as just those rudimentary principles would have saved us a lot of, anguish. Because there were a number of casualties along the way because of that.
Tuatahi e mihi ana ki a koe mō tēnei wāhanga kia noho tahi tāua. I roto i te whakaaro nui e pāna ki ngā toru te kau tau mō te tutuki tanga o tō tātou nei krimi. Welcome, Haydn. Thank you for spending the time to share some thoughts and reflections on the 30-year milestone since the Raupatu claim. It's been so long, yet it seemed like it was yesterday, eh?
It still feels like it's yesterday.
Can I just take you in our first kōrero to the time that you got involved with the iwi and kind of what was happening? What were you doing?
That's an interesting question because it was an interesting time. All I knew about the iwi was through my brother and my mum. We were both with the Tainu Māori Trust Board back in those days. And I was just trying to survive at university. But we used to have a paper, Nexus, at the university campus. And I remember reading an article about this pending settlement. And I responded to it. And then not long after that, there was the signing. That's when my older brother asked me to come along. And so I found myself as part of a line that we're facing away from Ahinarangi towards the people. And at that time, there was a lot of contention. And I personally didn't really understand the dynamics to it, but kind of understood the significance of it all, with the kind of dinners we used to have at home with my mum and older brother would share. And so I knew it was important, and it was, when it's at your marae, you just respond. So the day of the signing was a significant memory for me in the context of the settlement itself, but the other side to it as well. And so having to confront those that were not supportive of the whole settlement was interesting. In reflection, in retrospect, at the time it was, oh gosh, this feels like it's another game of league. The way that we were, lined up facing each other, and so we ended up having to escort some people off the premises, as they say, purely for the safety of and well-being of our kaumātua kuia, and also a lot of the rangatahi, a lot of our paiohi and children that were there. So,
well, let me take you to that moment on the marae. You had Tūranga Waiwai and Tani Wharau, league clubs who were
side by side,
the people side by side. And there were people inside the marae and outside of the marae. What was going through your mind when you saw, that dynamic?
What was going through my mind was after responding to the call to come and, help out the front. And so normally you're in the back. So when you get the call to come to the front, it's important. So I was naive to the occasion itself, but knew it was so important. And so just being anxious to make sure that, we did our part, our role properly. And that was just basically to protect the whānau in terms of if anything untoward, unexpected happens, because we didn't know what to expect. And so we just fulfilled that role the best we could. And, it's kind of like just providing safety. Kind of felt like an okati. Thou shalt not pass sort of sense, but yeah.
And back at university, there must have been robust conversations
there
and
was.
protests and things like that. Can you remember that?
I do. And I won't name names because they're our whanaunga. But what I will say, it was robust and confrontational at the university itself. And I think that's because it was on the back of a fiscal envelope in that whole debate. And it's in the context of, ngā haue whā, all iwi are there. So everybody had an opinion and people were taking sides. And so naturally, I felt the need to defend our position in terms of why we were doing the settlement, because it was just logic. We've got to start somewhere and we've got to break the ceiling somehow. Otherwise, we'll remain under the thumb. And so, and of course, I'm at that time, a student in political science and so it was front and centre. And there were lots of debates I remember in the library, but also a heated debate in our flat. And so, which kind of almost came to blows between us and our whanaunga and Te Arawa. And all those sorts of, but that was that's how controversial it was. And so the whole experience at university opened my eyes, because here I am doing a major in political science, and what better way to, without realising at the time, to live a life experience in itself.
So when you started forming an opinion or a view about Raupatu, that was partly informed by your brother and your mother and the conversations that you were exposed to there and university. Was there anywhere else where you learnt about the Raupatu settlement?
No, it wasn't. I was kind of a little bit embarrassed because I was kind of living a, heartland little small town of Marawa here. And this might sound unusual, but not oblivious, but aware of it, but not deep in it. It was almost like that old saying, be in it, but don't be of it. And that was kind of like a rule in our home to a certain degree, because there was so much politics. So it was important to be in it, but not to be of it. And it helped to keep our whānau on an even keel. It also helped to keep clarity. And so what I did do when I was at university was write and put an open letter in Nexus. I've never done that before. I just felt the need to do that, to respond to what was being said. And this is ironically how I became involved, was through that letter I wrote. I then was summoned to the Centre for Māori Studies and Research to meet a Mr. Bob Mahuta, who I knew about but never met before, never met him until that day. And at that time, I was a chemistry major when I was at uni, and I was in my second year. And I remember meeting him for the first time, and I was nervous, because I knew who he was. He was the chair of the trust board. So I thought, oh, this must be something about what I wrote. And I'm going to get a growling. And so he said, oh, what are you doing? What's your, at uni? What are your papers? And then he said, no, change, become a lawyer. And then I said, no, we've already got one or two of those in the family. And then he said, well, do something else. Don't do that. And I followed that advice and ended up doing political science. And then not long after that, I then got summons again, so to speak, to Tūrangawaewae to a consultation hui. And that was the 10th of August, 1996, because that's the same day that Tuti, Kupa and I started together, without realising we were starting on this journey together. And so I knew Tuti because she's from home. The late Sir Robert then called me up and said, and showed me a presentation and says, you read this? And I went, Shane just gave it to me about half an hour ago before we got here. And okay. And then he went like this and then basically said, you're up. and you'll present this. So this is in Kimiora, and you've got about 200 to 300 people. And I remember distinctively because as soon as I finished whatever I said it was just a complete blur because I was dropped in the deep end literally. And I only had to speak to 2 slides. And so I just regurgitated what was on the slide. I was that nervous. And then there was a question from the floor. And the question was, I went to the University of AFCO, and what you've said, how does that relate to my life here? And then all I heard was, oh, leave him alone, Ringa. Leave him alone. So it was Dad that asked that question, and Auntie Nuki Hagi and Auntie Iti told Dad off and said, oh, leave him alone. He's only, And so that's my first ever introduction of being dropped in the deep end.
But it wasn't your last. In fact,
wasn't my last, no.
You came through that early period with the tribe where you were often put into the deep end. Are there a couple of reflections and moments where you'd like to share that, being thrown into the deep end?
There are so many occasions. In actual fact, because you're just fresh out of university, you're green and wet behind the ears, snotty-nosed little kid, as sometimes we were referred to in Mihimihi, in a nice way. But, it felt like going from university where you do, work towards a big exam to this role where every day was a big exam. Every day you were dropped in the deep end. Every day it felt like, you had to be ready and be prepared to fall over all the time. And so there were many occasions, and I remember my first ever consultation hui that I had to do on my own. That felt like I had just done a whole PhD in half an hour in terms of the intensity of it. Other occasions when you're asked to lead a meeting or on a subject or to give a report. And 9 times out of 10, it's when you're not expecting it. And so it taught you very quickly to expect it. So if we were asked to go to the board meetings, it wasn't just to go there and listen. You had to be ready just in case a question is asked or just in case you're, expected to give an opinion or a view on something.
Who would you have considered were your mentors at the time?
Definitely the late Sir Robert was at that time, because I in retrospect, I see there were 2 stages to it. There was life with Sir Robert, and then there was the life without. And it was like night and day. When he was there was no one else in terms of the leadership role in the context of what he did in the space that we shared. Of course, there were other tribal leaders, but in terms of front and center, the mentor that for myself, I felt was he was it. And the mentor in the sense that it wasn't he would sit down and explain things to you verbatim. It was just vicariously by watching and observing and understanding and picking up the logic behind the things that he was doing. And then you quickly learned, I get it now. After a while, you begin to see a pattern. And then there are the other times where you did have that opportunity one-on-one. And probably into my second year, began to develop more of a one-on-one relationship with him. And it was always like 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning down the bottom here at Hopu Hopu. And I'll be in there trying to get ready for the day and do some extra work. And he was always up doing something. And so I would hear him shuffle down the corridor and then come in and then either give me something or ask a question. Through those experiences, understand more about the thinking and the logic.
You were part of a cadre of leaders that he wanted to be more deliberate about growing. They called them the grads. And there were, at various iterations of the grads, but I think you'd be considered to be in that group. What was the interaction between yourselves as you kind of started to get labelled the grads and got thrown all the kind of those jobs?
It was, so there was no manual to follow. There was no blueprint either that we knew of. And so we had to work it out for ourselves. And we all grew to know each other, our mannerisms and our different styles of doing things. And so what we did know is that the grads, they used to give us other nicknames, young guns and things like that. The whole purpose of it was to create a think tank and to develop critical thinking and to develop free thinking. We just started as if it was, in my view, as if we were doing a tutorial at university, and you just sit down and just begin to talk on an issue and begin to work it out. Even though we come from different disciplines, from law and business and politics and environmental and so forth, it was just being able to grow in confidence to be able to share your view and understanding that no one knows what the answer is. And also understanding that you're being given a task, a challenge, and to pick up that challenge and, try and rise to it.
Some people would call it faking it until you're making it. Others would call it learning on the job. Some people would say building the waka as we're trying to paddle it, you know. But there was a culture of learning as you go, and failure was okay. Is that a fair reflection of the environment that you were growing in?
Yeah, I definitely felt that way. Whilst it was okay to fail, you tried your best not to. And you're absolutely right. The analogy I prefer to use is you're building it as you go. And so felt that when you have that kind of context, you can push the envelope a bit because you know that there's no comparative. Once you're finished, then they'll compare it to what it should look like because there was nothing to compare it to. And that was without sounding pretentious or whakahihi about it. That was the mindset that you had to take, I felt, in order to have that kind of courage to give it a go. And then, literally go to a hui of about 300 or 400 people and then convince them that that's, what's the best thing to do or this is the way to go. And so, or to a board meeting, or in my particular role, every other weekend, if not every weekend, it was going to different marae within the rohe to talk about what's the new structure for us as a people.
So let me bring you to that point, because you were working in the iwi when the transition from the trust board through settlement to the new structure was being determined, and you played a role in the engagement. What types of questions were you asking the iwi to think about?
So from the presentation that we had as a template, it would pose questions like, are we looking at a marae level of representation, a hapu structure, or an iwi structure, or a regional structure? Is it a corporate one, or is it a tikanga-based traditional structure? So those were the default type questions. But then what flowed from that was, in all honesty, no one really knew. You had a few individuals within the iwi, and you could usually knew who they were because they were the most vocal. And so, and then you had a few entertainers and some really skillful orators, and they added a lot of colour to the kōrero, and this kōrero went for about 3 years. So first round in the first year, was to set the scene. The second round was then to take what the feedback was from the first year and then to build on that. So hopefully by the third year, we kind of have an answer. In all honesty, the people were really putting their faith in us to know what that looks like best. So what they were looking for is, give us what you think it is, and then tell us why you think it's that one. And then we can go from there. No one ever came forward really with a submission on what a model would be in terms of how it works. We did get submissions in terms of we prefer marae or we prefer hapu, but that's as far as it would go. There would be no sort of like breakdown of the infrastructure and, the capability and capacity and everything else that's needed. It was, I prefer hapu or I'm pro marae.
So that's the conversation that the tribe was having with itself. What was the media saying, during this period of transition? Can you recall any of the reporting on?
I think the media, there wasn't that much other than like the people themselves waiting, anticipating what it might be. But I don't think there was any real, from memory, any real opinion from the media, from mainstream media. I know at an iwi level there were, an inter-iwi level there was, that's outside of the media. And there was lots of speculations on what the best governance type structure would be best. And so, this whole thing about separation of governance and management theory, some would say it was a half-baked theory, because as Māori, we take a holistic approach. So you can't have a separation. You had the theory around, you've got to build your asset base first. That worked for some tribes, but not for others, and so there were lots of opinions floating around amongst different iwi. And then, of course, when Ngaitahu were doing theirs, there were lots of comparisons between Tainui and Ngaitahu, who had the right model going forward in terms of their tapapa tipu runanga type structure, and now at that time tekau hanganui type structure or tekau whanganui type structure. So in the media, I don't think there was that much commentary or opinion, because we ourselves were still formulating it. And so I think they were giving us the benefit of the doubt in terms of letting us develop that before they started forming any real opinion on us.
So in the final analysis, as you pulled everything together, all the feedback, and then went back with the model, how did that conversation go? And did you convince the iwi about the approach, or did you have to tweak it still some more?
I had to do a bit of both, in all honesty. So the best way to do that, we found, was to then say, well, it looks like we're narrowing it down. And so I remember the presentation would have, here are the options. This is what an iwi model looks like. This is what the hapu looks like. This is what the marae looks like. This is what a regional looks like. And then you would go into the machinations around the pros and cons of each model. And you could see a clear steer towards one particular option. But then they begin to look at, what are the strengths and weaknesses. So if it's the marae model, they would see that, you get great representation, but it's not as effective when it comes to the practical side of decision making, i.e. you have a room full of 183 people to make a decision. It can be very difficult, and we were going down to basic things like, so how does that voting process look? What are the rules and what are the decisions and the mechanisms for all of this? If it's a marae model, if it's a hapu one, how do you get traction on representation when it's an area-based? It's not a focal point like a marae with a clear boundary. And so all those sorts of, discussions were happening. By the third year, it became really interesting.
With the wisdom of hindsight and the opportunity to reflect, is there anything about that consultation on the type of structure that you would have liked to have maybe done it, changed?
Yeah, bias aside, I think if I put it this way, and just to sum it up in a nutshell, if we went through the full Te Kauhanganui structure and applied that in its fullness, then I think we might have got something pretty robust and solid for us to be able to work with them. So we kind of went so far with it and then stopped. And then we thought we would then allow the rest to come organically. In hindsight, I think we should have gone right through that whole structure because within the fullness of the Te Kauhanganui structure, there was a manuariki, a bicameral system, upper house, lower house. We didn't have that. We had a executive body and the house. So that's only one part. We were missing the manuariki part. And in the context of what we went through, that then transpired with all of our ups and downs we were having, the manuariki would have been the ama to our waka. It would have been the tauraparapa to our waka and kept our balance. And so that's one thing I think that would have been really interesting to see if we'd followed it right through the blueprint that was set by Tawhio Ma'an back then.
It felt like at the time there was an impatience, and so you just didn't have the luxury of time to let things bed in, mature, and then be able to evolve. And most of our challenges happened in that, in that impatient period of wanting to see progress and success. Are there learnings that we should take forward from our challenge years that we should never, ever repeat again?
100%. In terms of the wee wah, the ups and downs that came from having without putting too fine a point to it, half the structure in place. And to the analogy of as we were building the waka, you're in dry dock. You build your waka before you launch it. So we're in dry dock. We thought, we can launch it now, which we did. And then all of a sudden you realise there's a spring there and the water's leaking in here and a bit of water leaking in there. So you've got to haul it back out and then fix all of those leaks. And so that was very much the scenario for us within that realm in terms of building our new waka to go forward. And so the lessons there, and I touched on it, was, if we had seen it right through to its fullness, I think it might have been different, because that one key component is exactly what was needed to keep us on an even keel. And in reflection, we kind of had that indirectly through our kaumātua that were present. They provided a lot of that, but not in a formal sense in terms of a upper house within the manuariki, manukura type structure. And it was a real privilege and luxury to have some of our kaumātua side by side with us, shoulder to shoulder, like JH, John Haunui and Puka Mepia and others. It gave us a sense as these young ones, a sense of stability around that space. And so we knew they supported us, so we kept going. But if we translated that into the structure itself, I think it would have, taken us to another level. Mm-hmm.
I guess that's where the tikanga side of the structure was not as present as the more organisational governance kind of components.
Very much so.
We were unkind to ourselves in that early period. Character assassinations, and that's from the top all the way through. I think people were more judging of intent, even though everyone was trying to do the best that they can. There was a lot of suspicion. There was a lot of negative narrative with the media. And perhaps at its worst, it played out with things like writing down of assets and then criticisms over, a seemingly show of wealth and all of that. So those were what I would say are the challenge years. And then this being brought into scrutiny, and then the prospect of Te Ata going to court, all of that period of time, it's my view that we should be learning from that so we don't repeat it.
Yes.
But if I were to ask people who were around at the time, so what would we do different? How could we better future-proof ourselves so that we can be robust, be critical, be transparent and open, and assure ourselves that we're doing all the due diligence to make the best decisions going forward, but we don't have to take people out along the way.
Yeah.
What can we learn from our experience?
If there's one thing I want to share, and it's on this question, because first of all, that's why I separate the two periods within our development in that past 30 years. Life with the late Sir Robert, and then life after without. And once he was gone, things really went pear-shaped. And to me, what was glaringly obvious was there was a vacuum, not just because he was gone, but because what went when he was gone, and what went was the intellectual leadership that he provided. And I think that more than anything is what, at a rangatahi level, I felt, is what gave us the courage to do what we did as a graduate team. Once he was gone, we struggled. Without that intellectual leadership there, we then reverted back to type, which became more academic. And what I mean by that is we then began to look at things according to the letter of the law. And this is where the whole discussion around ture versus tikanga, LAW versus LORE, the rift or dichotomy between the two is literally what separated us. And so it felt like there was a line in the sand for those that were tikanga whānau over here, all of yous who are ture in that space here, over here. And it created this huge rift. And that was never there because there was a level of intellectual leadership that filled the void, that brought the two together. And I remember him saying to me once in one of our many discussions at early hours of the morning at Raupatu, he said, that's a half-baked theory. There's governance, separation of management and management separation of governance. It won't work. And he gave a whole number of reasons, and he was right. And so that was reflective of that time where without that intellectual leadership to keep us in that balance between the two, LAW versus LORE, we found ourselves in two camps. We were fragmented. If there was another component to it, and it is part of the tikanga side of it, which was missing from those that were following the LAW, which includes myself and the role that I was playing. And so as the senior policy analyst for the tribe by title and doing this whole structure, I had to rely on what I knew best for what we were doing and hope like heck the part that's missing in terms of the tikanga will come. And so when we had split because of our structure, it then forced us into those two camps. And what was missing was the fundamental tikanga 101, which is, relevant to any society, traditional society, not just Māori, was the whole tika pono aroha. And so what was missing was the aroha for each other. What was missing was the aroha for, I know your intentions are good, but you didn't get it right. And then it's the aroha that allows us to get past that. And so I developed a matrix on tika pono and aroha, and a simple matrix of a y-x axis. So along the x-axis, the horizontal one, I had pono, and the why I had tika. And so when you're high in tika but low in pono, you become it's a unilateral governance. You become a dictator. Or what the young ones call, you become a Karen, because you're too busy trying to be more tika than the other person. And that was the camp I found myself in. And then when you have those that are high in pono, which in pono in this context is when you're true to yourself, but you're low in tika, then it's more of a, what I called it, termed at that time when I wrote that paper, was a corporate style of governance. And the example was, we build a residential development and there are a lot of environmental issues. But from a pono point of view, it helped to grow the settlement. But from a tika point of view, it did a lot of damage to the environment and to the community, because they were all butter box style houses and that sort of thing. So that was my example there. And then when you're low, and in both tika and pono, then it's just dysfunctional. And so that was my way of comprehending where we were at different stages. And it kind of, you just flowed in and out of those different quadrants. And so a large part of the period we went through, I felt, was because everybody was trying to be more tika than the other person around what they thought was the right thing to do, which is essentially the cause of all politics, when somebody's trying to be more right in that basic sense.
You've characterised really well, that litigious period and where we got to as a people. And I like the analogy around tika and pono and
Aroha.
Yeah. We forgot the aroha part on the way through, and we can't go back to that point. We can't be like that going forward. So, if you were to reflect again on that challenge period, the litigious years and what we lost sight of, what are the learning points?
Yeah, the learning points to me, so one of them is around, I spoke about earlier, about the intellectual leadership. So if you got intellectual leadership, you can pretty much figure your way through it. You've got that ability to do that. But the other component that's equally, if not more so important than intellectual leadership, was the moral leadership. And that's where the aroha and abundance comes in. And we know, like I said, that's very much an intrinsic part of our tikanga, the tika pono aroha. The three most universal principles you can get. And the most important one was the aroha, and that's what we missed. And so when there was this power vacuum, so to speak, of what the tribe was going through, everybody that was involved, I felt, sort of rallied to two sides. And that only happened because in terms of we were building our waka too quickly, but because we didn't have the luxury of time to fine-tune our waka. If we had, I think we would have, in reflection, of course, seen where those potential risks are within our structure. And that biggest one was not having that manuariki overlay, which would have been a real korowai to insulate us from going down the path we ended up. We ended up in court because we were trying to be too tika in terms of the LAW. And being privy to a lot of those discussions at the time and in the room at the time when those critical decisions were being made, without a shadow of a doubt or word of a lie, you knew instinctively that it wasn't tika, if I can put it that way. Because when you add the aroha into it, I remember in that room, there wasn't a dry eye. And it wasn't tears of, elation or relief. It was tears of, we've lost something here. It was tears of emotive feeling within your gut. Was right to do, but really in the overall, it wasn't. And you just hope like heck that by the time it got there, it would come right.
Years have passed, at least 20 years have passed since that period of time. Do you think that there's a maturity to be able to bring back together what was lost?
Oh, 100%. And because we're talking about a generation of maturity. We're talking about what's relevant, because relative, I should say, not relevant, what's relative in our experience. So for what we went through, that was relative to us for our biggest challenge. And if we're able to capture the lessons from that and provide that as a ballast in our waka, as a sea anchor in our waka, then that's going to bring real added value going forward for the next generation to be able to hopefully follow those lessons. And so from a waka kaupapa point of view, on our waka we have our taurapa, and then you have all of the carvings that represent all the navigational points of the journeys we've taken. That's just added to our taurapa as tainui. And whoever our kaihotu for our waka is in the future will hopefully look back at that taurapa and go, well, that's right. There are some rocks over there, and we'd better avoid those rocks and not run aground again.
I hazard a guess, but there will be a lot of people who don't know anything about our 30-year kind of experience and think about the challenge years as some stuff happened and went down. They don't really know what it is because people aren't prepared yet to talk about the level of emotion attached to decisions that were made that caused the split, that made people choose this side or that side.
Yeah.
That the kingitanga question, being brought front row centre as a part of that split and things like that. So it may be hard for people to still talk about it, but I'm of a view that if we can present our history in all its warts and all, and we're telling this story, then we're saying, well, we're locking this in because we don't want to lose it from our living memory. But when I think about, for example, the potential of te ata being taken to court, I would hope that never happens again. When I think about people who tried to do good within the tribe but didn't have a hohauterongo process to try and balance up what they were doing in terms of their professional role and responsibility, but also to not be totally disenfranchised from the tribe, I would hope that we're learning from that. When I think about the litigious avenue that for poor governance decisions we were paying to take ourselves to court, that we would not have to replicate any of that because it's all dumbness. And I say that because,
100%.
I just think we owe it to our kids.
Yeah.
We've got the capacity to try and ensure from here on in we're going to improve the robustness and the clarity of decision making so that the next 30 years are going to be even better. What are we absolutely bringing forward in terms of improved learning for our waka going forward?
Well, obviously those lessons around how important it is to have a balance within your structure, because the form and structure creates the style of the leadership going forward. So, and what I mean by that, which harks back to what I was saying before, we had half our structure there, and so we got half the result.
But surely it's about culture as well?
And that was the other half that was missing. Yeah, and that's why the part we had was right down to the rules, was very much the Westminster model, very much the council, parliament rules that I referred to look at in terms of, well, that's the Westminster model that Kingi Tawhao brought back in terms of, and we followed that.
Actually, I want to stop you on that and just insert, because not many people will know that you were given the responsibility of trying to write the rules for the Kauhanga Nui. So what was going on in your mind when you were pulling together rules that nobody knew what they were going to be?
It was like a mission impossible, because it's also critical to understand the timing of that too. And so you've got a representative body of 183 plus people, and you've got very much a dynamic period in our history and uncharted waters. And so going to Ruku Moana Marae helped, because when I saw the rules and regulations that they had right down to dog tax back in the 1800s, I thought, oh, well, if it was good enough for them to follow, then I thought, well, let's apply that same template. That was my logical thinking at the time, without trying to reinvent the wheel or also come up with something completely new that nobody would have understood because it was too new. So that was part of it. In terms of just coming back to the litigious side, be remiss of me not to share this, because I think there's some valuable lessons in itself from this interview that would, be good to share. And that is the personality politics of the day is what drove us in a certain direction on both sides of the, divide of tika and ture. L-A-W, L-O-R-E. That's what drove us on both sides. And what was missing was, what was on this side with the ones following the L-A-W was they felt that it was to protect our ariki from being pulled down into the paru of politics within the tribe. Yes and no. In hindsight, yes and no. Yes in theory, no in reality. And this is where having a full understanding of our tika pono and aroha as just those rudimentary principles would have saved us a lot of, anguish. Because there were a number of casualties along the way because of that. And it really did, whether by baptism of fire or not, begin to refine the next few years going forward. To some degree, it was a real handbrake, because we had to wait for all of that, those political dynamics within the iwi to settle before we could actually see what it looks like. So I think we went through a period where there was a vacuum in terms of intellectual leadership, moral leadership. Those really the two that matter the most. And so in my mind, I refer to that as the patuariki on our waka that help us, guide our waka, the tauihu, going forward. And when you have one of them missing, you just go wee wawa. And so trying to write rules to correct a waka that's only got one half an eye working is nigh on impossible. And so 30 years on, I think we're in a better space, not just because of the passage of time, but because of the fact that in that time, we've built a depth within our iwi, real latent potential amongst our rangatahi that fills that very void. They do have their own manamotuhake, their own independence, their own style, but they are more entrenched, I believe, in our tikanga than we as young grads were. And I say that collectively because other than maybe one or two, none of us really had that entrenched understanding of tikanga. We were all fresh out of university. And so maybe within that team, the skill set that was missing was our tikanga person, perhaps, to a certain degree. Some did try their best to fill that role and in a good way. And but it would have really had to been someone of real stature to be able to fill that role at that time.
Can I ask you, who were the kaumātua and kuia that provided a korowai for you at the sounding board?
So for me personally, always John Honui, Uncle Tahi, in his own characteristic, unique way, because he was always, never slow off the mark in terms of seeing the funny side of things. But it's through humour that you really got the message. And so he had that gift. JH, it was always, you knew it was solid because it was entrenched in the depth of kōrero you had to go with it. To be honest, it was just their presence that gave me comfort to sort of, okay, well, we're still talking to each other, so that's good. right down to that rudimentary basic level of being whanaunga. And I felt aroha for a lot of our kaumātua because sometimes they were put in positions where they were asked to choose or felt they had to. 9 times out of 10, they never did. They always supported both and encouraged both. And that's probably one of the big lessons for us going forward, which once again reinforces that need to have that manuariki part to our structure.
If you were to reflect on some key bits of advice that you got, especially when you were going through kind of struggles within the iwi that have guided you for everything that you've done since, what would that be?
Don't isolate yourself. So when you go through struggles, no matter what age you are, if you keep your cool in the eye of the storm, it always comes from being present with others. If you isolate yourself, the noise just gets louder. The other part of the advice around that time, when dealing with a situation like that, is don't internalize it or personalize it. So a good example of that for my tuakana and I, we were seen as being one brother on this side, the other brother on that side, and characterized as Cain and Abel, which one was Abel, which one was Cain. But without, word of a lie, every night when we got home, we either never talked about it, or when we did, it was always trying to find a solution to it. And you would say, what are you guys doing? And we said, well, we're trying to do this and this, but we're doing this and this and this. And so it was always trying to seek a solution and, trying to pull ourselves out of the whirlpool that we were going down in our waka. And to this day, we have those sort of conversations as siblings do. And it brought us closer as brothers. And so many times we'll talk about when Sir Robert wasn't with us, what he would do as if he were with us and remind ourselves, oh, you remember that rangatahi hui we had down at Manu Kōrero in the Atu building? And we had all of these agencies come here and he talked about not being agents of the Crown and, collective gain, collective benefit, all the principles around the settlement. And we had those sorts of discussions and reflect on where we've gone wrong or where we've gone right. Because it hasn't all been wrong. I think what we went through is definitely, without sounding like a cliche, makes us stronger. And that's, 100% where we are today. The things that we've learned has definitely made us stronger. So I feel the lesson from the experience going through the downs that we had experienced, the uplift in it is a lot of in today's generation may not have been aware of it or even privy to it, so to speak, which is a good thing, but we've got to share it anyway to make sure they go, oh, I remember they talked about they had this thing called a high court action against, their ariki, and what did they do? So obviously not wanting to go down that path ever again.
I have sitting in my my own personal archives the sealed letters to each of the individuals who were a part of that. They remain sealed because thankfully we didn't have to go there. But they will stay with me as a living reminder to mature ourselves through that hurtful time so that we can be better people, so that our iwi can be better as well. So I want to thank you for sharing as much as you shared, but also, when I interviewed your brother Shane, one of his proudest achievements was developing Hohau Te Rongo. And it speaks exactly to the context that you have highlighted today. And I would like to ask you the same question that I asked him. What is your most proudest moment in terms of your contribution to the iwi?
Oh, contribution would be, without sounding funny about it, it's just being there. And then what I mean by that, it was when I first started and I realised when the penny dropped that I'd have no free weekends for 3 years. But in hindsight, there was a real privilege to have gone to every single marae. Before that, I only knew where Turanga Waiwai was and where Wāhi and a couple of other marae were, and Tangiro. But that was it. After that, it was knowing where all the marae are, having an understanding to as much as you could when you're exposed to that level of, consultation, the taonga that it gives you. So it may not be the answer in terms of what's the contribution I've given. It's other than just being present to serve. And the way that summed it up for me was when Mum said to me, "Oh, you going to that farewell for you?" And I said, yeah. We go, "Well, you don't need to, because don't worry about having a farewell. You're not going anywhere. What are you going to a farewell for?" And she kind of made her point subtly, and it was just simple. We're here to serve. And so that's how I've always looked at it in terms of when we say mahi a te mahi, we're here to serve our people. And that's what Mum meant. You don't need to have a big flash farewell because you're doing it for your tupuna, you're doing it for your uri. So that's the sense. So just being present to serve was the best answer I can give.
It's a great answer. Are there any final reflections that you'd like to share as we close out the interview?
Not to labour the point, but just to that whole hohautorongo, absolutely, the manuariki, absolutely, lessons for the future of where we are going at the moment. And I think if it is about devolution and manamutuhake ultimately, then that's the best way to get there. If we go down the LAW path again, we'll end up going back at square one.
Tēnā koe. Ngā mihi atura kia koe mō tēnei wāhanga. Kia whakatau i ngā piki me ngā heke o a tātou nei iwi me ngā mahi e mahi nei e tātou kei roto ki tērā tuāhuatanga. Aha koa te āwhiowhio o te wā. Kua ngui noia nei, ki au nei, kua ngui. So me whakangu, kia whakarāpopoto i roto i te nākau tika, me te nākau pono, kia mārama te titiro o te anga whakamua. Nō reira i roto i te rā mihi ana ki a koe ki a tātou.
Mahuri ora.
Thank you.
Thank you.